It's funny how diners have a way of attracting regulars. There's always that one person who comes in at the same time, orders the same thing, and sits at the same booth. I've worked at Ruby's Diner for 3 years, and I've gotten to know all the regulars by name except one. He started coming in about 6 months ago. Every Thursday night around 11:30 p.m, he'd stroll in, sit at the booth in the far corner by the window, and order black coffee. No food, no small talk, just coffee. He was always dressed the same way too, a long dark trench coat, even when it was warm outside. He never removed his hat, one of those old-fashioned fedoras that made him look like he'd stepped out of a film noir. We never interacted much beyond me bringing him his coffee. He'd nod in thanks, never meeting my eyes, then stare out the window, lost in his own world. I didn't think much of him. Quiet regulars aren't exactly unusual, especially during the late shift. But one night about a month ago, things started getting weird. It was a slow Thursday night. The clock had just ticked past 11:30 p.m. when I realized something. The man hadn't come in. I glanced at the corner booth out of habit, half expecting to see him sitting there, but it was empty. I found it strange, but again, people skip a night sometimes, right? No big deal. Then, just as I was wiping down the counter, the bell above the door jingled. I looked up and saw him. Same trench coat, same fedora, same distant expression. He walked over to his usual booth and sat down. I grabbed a mug, filled it with coffee, and headed over. "Late tonight, huh?" I said, trying to make conversation. He didn't respond. He just stared out the window, the same way he always did. His hands were resting on the table, one finger tapping rhythmically on the side of the cup, though he never actually touched the coffee. I stood there for a moment waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, but he didn't even glance in my direction. I shrugged it off and returned to the counter, figuring he was just one of those guys who preferred silence. But as I walked away, I had this nagging feeling like something was off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't until I was closing out the register later that I noticed something strange. The coffee cup on his table was still full. He hadn't taken a single sip. I walked over to his booth, expecting to find his usual crumpled dollar bills as payment, but the table was completely empty. No money, no sign of him ever being there, just the untouched coffee, still steaming. I didn't see him leave. Confused, I looked around the diner. The front door was still closed, the bell above it silent. There were no other customers in the diner, and Dave, the night cook, was in the back, oblivious to everything. I asked Dave if he had seen the man leave. He shook his head. "I didn't see anyone come in at all tonight. You've been alone up front." That gave me chills. I knew I had served him. I saw him sitting there. I brought him coffee. I couldn't have imagined that. But the unease only deepened the next Thursday. I was dreading the shift, but 11:30 came, and sure enough, the man walked in, same trench coat, same hat, same distant gaze. This time, I watched him carefully, trying to make sense of what was happening. He sat in his usual booth, and I brought him his coffee, just like always. And just like before, he didn't touch it. I didn't bother trying to talk to him this time. I just left the cup on the table and returned to the counter, watching him from a distance. The diner felt colder than usual, like there was an invisible draft that chilled my bones. After about 20 minutes, I looked up again, and he was gone. I hadn't heard the door. The bell hadn't jingled. I rushed to the booth, but like the week before, the cup was full and steaming, no money, no trace. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the untouched coffee, my mind racing. I had served him. I had seen him walk in and sit down, but now it was like he'd never existed. That night, I asked around about him. None of the other employees had noticed anything strange about the man, or at least they hadn't paid attention. But something about his sudden appearances, his vanishing act, and the fact that he never drank the coffee unnerved me deeply. It was the third week that finally pushed me over the edge. By now, I had become almost obsessed with the man. I couldn't stop thinking about him, who he was, where he came from, and why he seemed to vanish into thin air. I decided I would confront him if he came in again. I wanted answers. At 11:30, like clockwork, the door opened and he walked in. This time, though, something was different. As he sat down in his booth, I noticed he wasn't just staring out the window. He was staring at me. I felt my heart race as I grabbed the coffee pot and made my way over to his booth. When I set the mug down, he didn't look away. His eyes, usually distant and unfocused, were locked on mine. For the first time since he started coming in, he spoke. "Do you remember me?" His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. I shook my head slowly. "I don't think we've met before. You're a regular, right?" He didn't blink. "We've met. You've seen me before, but you don't remember, do you?" I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. There was something about his voice, something familiar yet distant, like a memory that was just out of reach. I couldn't place it, but deep down I knew he was right. "I don't understand," I said. His eyes softened, but it wasn't a look of comfort. It was almost sad. "You've forgotten," he murmured, "just like the others." "The others?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stood up slowly, towering over me, his trench coat swaying slightly with his movement. "I come here because I'm waiting. You'll understand soon enough." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. I wanted to stop him, to demand an explanation, but my feet wouldn't move. I watched as he reached the door, and as he opened it, the bell jingled faintly. But when the door closed, he wasn't there. He hadn't stepped outside. He had just vanished. I quit the diner the next day. I couldn't stay there, not after that. I've since heard that the man still comes in every Thursday at 11:30, sits in his booth and stares out the window. They say he never drinks his coffee. There's something about working the night shift that changes you. Maybe it's the hours, the silence, or the way time seems to stretch longer than it should. I worked the graveyard shift at a diner on the outskirts of a small town for almost a year, and during that time I had my fair share of strange encounters, but none of them compare to the night I met the man who never left. The diner itself wasn't much, just a little joint with faded red booths, an old jukebox that hadn't worked in years, and a counter that always felt sticky no matter how often we wiped it down. Most of our customers were truckers passing through, or the occasional drunk who needed to sober up after a night at the bar down the road. That night, though, it was quiet, too quiet. It was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen a customer in over an hour. The only sound was the low hum of the fridge and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I was standing behind the counter, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, when the door creaked open and a man walked in. He looked out of place. He wasn't dressed like the usual truckers or late-night customers. His clothes were neat, almost formal, a dark button-up shirt, black slacks, and polished shoes that clicked softly against the tile floor. He was tall, with short, neatly combed hair, and he moved with a deliberate, almost mechanical grace. He didn't acknowledge me as he made his way to a booth in the far corner of the diner, the one right under the flickering light. Without a word, he sat down facing the window, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Something about him made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed a menu and walked over, forcing a smile. "Hey there, what can I get you tonight?" He didn't look at me. He didn't even move. His eyes were fixed on the window, staring out into the empty parking lot. "Sir?" I asked, my voice a little shakier than I intended. "Are you ready to order?" Finally, he turned his head toward me. His eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were wide, too wide, and they didn't blink. It was as if he wasn't seeing me at all, like he was looking right through me. "I'm waiting for someone," he said, his voice low and flat. "Oh, okay," I replied, trying to keep my composure. "Can I get you some coffee while you wait?" He nodded slowly, and I hurried back to the counter, grateful to put some distance between us. As I poured his coffee, I kept glancing over at him, feeling uneasy. He was still staring out the window, his face completely expressionless. I brought the coffee to his table and set it down in front of him. "There you go," I said, forcing a smile again. "Let me know if you need anything else." He didn't respond. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should say something else, but he didn't even seem to notice I was still there. I backed away slowly and returned to my spot behind the counter, watching him carefully. Minutes passed, then an hour. The man didn't touch his coffee, didn't move, didn't look away from the window. It was like he was frozen in place. By 3:30 a.m., I started to wonder if I should ask him to leave. My shift was ending soon and the diner was about to close for the night, but something about him made me hesitant. There was a stillness about him that I couldn't explain, a feeling that if I disturbed him, something bad would happen. As I stood there debating, the door creaked open again. Another man walked in, this one dressed much more casually with a worn leather jacket and jeans. He looked around the diner, his eyes landing on the man in the booth. Without a word, he walked over and sat down across from him. I felt a wave of relief. Whoever this guy was, he had been telling the truth. He really had been waiting for someone. Maybe now I could stop worrying about him and get back to closing up. But as I watched them, the relief quickly turned to unease again. The two men didn't speak. They just sat there, staring at each other. The tension between them was palpable, like there was some unspoken conversation happening that I couldn't hear. I didn't know what to do. I had never seen anything like this before. Should I call the police? Should I go over and ask if everything was all right? I stood frozen behind the counter, unsure of what the right move was. And then the man in the jacket did something that sent chills down my spine. He reached across the table and placed his hand on the other man's wrist. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was firm, like a warning. The man in the suit didn't react at first. He just stared at the hand on his wrist, his expression still blank. But then, slowly, his eyes moved up to meet the other man's. And for the first time that night, I saw something flicker across his face, something dark. I didn't want to watch anymore. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with cleaning the counter, but I couldn't stop glancing over at them. The two men were still sitting there, locked in that strange, silent standoff. Then, without warning, the man in the jacket stood up. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at me. He just walked out of the diner, the door swinging shut behind him. I exhaled, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. I looked back at the man in the suit, expecting him to leave too. But he didn't move. He just sat there, staring down at the table now, his hands clenched into fists. It was almost 4 a.m. and I was more than ready to be done with my shift. I walked over to him, my hands shaking slightly. "Sir, we're closing soon. Are you all right?" He didn't respond. His breathing was heavy now, like he was trying to keep himself calm. I backed away, not wanting to provoke him. Finally, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and placed it on the table. Without another word, he walked out, leaving the untouched cup of coffee behind. I locked the door as soon as he was gone, my heart racing. I didn't know what had just happened, but I was glad it was over. The next morning, when I came in for my shift, I asked my boss if he had seen either of the men before. He hadn't. I asked around town, but no one knew anything about them. It was like they had disappeared. But the weirdest part, that $20 bill he left on the table. When I picked it up, I noticed something strange. It was old, really old, like it had been printed decades ago before any of the new designs. I showed it to my boss, and he told me it was from the 1970s, way too old to still be in circulation. I don't know who those men were or what their meeting was about, but I'm sure of one thing. They weren't just strangers passing through. And that night, whatever happened at Rosie's Diner, I was a witness to something I'll never fully understand. A few years ago, I was working the late shift at Rosie's Diner. It's one of those small roadside places that hasn't changed since the 60s. Sticky red booths, chrome counters, and neon lights that buzz all night long. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I got used to the quiet of the late-night crowd, mostly truckers, night owls, or the occasional traveler passing through. I liked the solitude. It was just me and our short-order cook, Dave, who worked in the back and didn't say much. The night shifts were usually slow, especially after 1 a.m., when the roads emptied out and the only sound was the hum of the lights and the sizzle of grease from the kitchen. That particular night was unusually dead. Not a single customer had walked in for over an hour. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I looked up to see a man walk in. He was tall, wearing a weathered brown jacket, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, and he had this blank, almost vacant expression that instantly made me uneasy. "Hey there, take a seat anywhere," I called out, forcing a friendly tone. He didn't respond. He just walked slowly toward one of the booths by the window and sat down, staring out into the empty parking lot. I grabbed a menu and went over to his table. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee?" I asked. He didn't look at me, just kept staring out the window. "Water," he muttered, barely audible. "Sure thing," I said, trying to shake the weird vibe. I brought him a glass of water and left him the menu. "I'll give you a minute to decide." I went back behind the counter, watching him from a distance. He never touched the menu, just sat there, motionless, staring outside. The lights in the parking lot cast long shadows, and the only movement was the occasional flicker from the old neon sign out front. After a few minutes, I walked back over to him. "Ready to order?" He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were empty. I don't know how else to describe it, just completely void of life, like he was somewhere else, far away from that diner. "I'm not hungry," he said, his voice flat and distant. I didn't know how to respond. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my skin crawl. There was something about this guy that wasn't right, but I couldn't just tell him to leave. So I nodded awkwardly and went back behind the counter. For the next half hour, the man just sat there sipping his water slowly, never looking away from the window. Dave came out from the kitchen at one point, wiping his hands on a towel, and gave me a look as if to ask, "What's up with that guy?" I shrugged. "Weird customer," I whispered. Dave grunted and went back into the kitchen. The quiet stretched on, and I couldn't focus on anything but the strange man. Every now and then, I'd glance over at him, and every time he was still staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "They're coming for me." I froze, not sure if I'd heard him right. "Sorry, what was that?" "They're coming for me," he repeated, louder this time, his eyes still locked on the dark parking lot. "Who's coming for you?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stood up and walked toward the door. I watched as he stepped outside, pausing just outside the diner, standing under the neon light, still staring into the distance. I was about to call out to him, ask if he was all right, when Dave came back out of the kitchen. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking out at the man. "I don't know," I admitted. "He said someone was coming for him." Dave frowned and walked over to the door, peeking outside. "There's no one out there." I followed Dave's gaze. The parking lot was completely empty, save for the man who was now pacing back and forth near the edge of the lot, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "We should call someone," I said, my unease growing. "This guy's not right." Dave nodded, and I reached for the phone behind the counter. Just as I picked it up, I heard the sound of tires screeching. A car pulled into the parking lot at full speed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It came to a sudden stop near the man, and two figures stepped out. They were dressed in dark clothing, and though I couldn't see their faces clearly, there was something menacing about the way they moved. Quick, deliberate, like they knew exactly what they were doing. The man in the brown jacket didn't run, he didn't scream. He just stood there, completely still, as the two figures approached him. "Dave," I whispered, fear creeping into my voice. "We need to call the cops." But before I could dial, the two figures grabbed the man by the arms, shoving him roughly into the back seat of the car. The door slammed shut, and within seconds the car peeled out of the lot, disappearing into the night. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, completely stunned. What the hell had just happened? Dave was the first to speak. "Who were those people?" I don't know," I stammered. "He said someone was coming for him, but..." I dialed 911, my hands shaking. When the operator answered, I explained what had happened as best I could, but it sounded insane. "A strange man comes into the diner, says someone is after him, then two people show up, take him, and drive off." The police arrived about 15 minutes later. By then, there was nothing left to see, just the empty parking lot and the fading glow of the neon sign. They asked me and Dave a few questions, but there wasn't much we could tell them. The man hadn't given us a name, and we had no idea where the car had gone. The officers took a report and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe us. I mean, who would? I never found out who the man was, or who those people were that took him. There was no missing persons report that matched his description, no news stories, no follow-up from the police. It was like he had never existed. But I know what I saw. I'll never forget the way he looked sitting in that booth, staring out the window as if he knew his time was running out. I don't know what he was running from, or why those people came for him. But that night at Rosie's Diner has haunted me ever since, and every time I hear the bell above the door jingle, I half expect to see him walk in again, waiting for someone who will eventually come.